Alright, at one point in Yu-Gi-Oh history, today's deck build performed incredibly well in the meta. Then it's extremely broken, never should have been created in the first place, spell card got banned, and the deck just kept falling down the rankings as new decks emerged, passing it. Can everyone guess what deck we're going to review today without looking at the screen? That's right, it's time to build a Prophecy Spellbooks deck. One of the first big questions when creating the deck is deciding between World and High Priestess. High Priestess is definitely the more consistent card due to the less restrictions on her effect, but World's effect is game-breaking, with the ability to single-handedly win the duel. With this in mind, I prefer 2 copies of High Priestess and 1 copy of World. Some might argue that utilizing both World and High Priestess is inefficient because their skills work against each other, which is true to an extent. However, proper deck design with regards to spellbook selection can mitigate this combativeness somewhat. And that is all the high-level prophecy monsters I run in this deck, because when looking at all of the other available options, there are some significant problems. For example, Wheel. This card's effect is simply not useful in a world where Spellbook of Fate is limited to 1. If Fate were at 2 or 3, then Wheel might have a role in certain builds, but Spellbook Banishment is too infrequent in general to justify using a summons to trigger this effect. Maybe this card could work for those who want to combine it with Destroyer, but because I don't use Destroyer, this option is a moot point. Speaking of which, moving on to Destroyer, there are 2 ways of playing spellbooks. You can focus on banishing the books from the graveyard, or you can focus on leaving them in your graveyard. I prefer the latter method, which makes running Destroyer a direct contradiction to this strategy. Overall, I really view Destroyer as just a situational mini beat stick that doesn't really serve the deck well in general. Moving on to Reaper. Reaper is a card that has a lot of potential, but has difficulty living up to it because its effect requirements are what I almost call kind of just a bridge too far. The big problem with Reaper, for me at least, when I used to run it, is that running it at 1 is not very useful. I don't use the Destroyer Wheel build, so you can't take advantage of using it with regards to those cards. But when you run multiples, I end up drawing it too frequently into my hand instead of through cards like Temperance. Overall, I think the only useful effect of Reaper is the last one, and getting 5 different spellbooks into the grave. One other dark spellcasters in the deck forces kind of risky deck design. If Reaper's last effect could summon from the hand or the deck instead of just the deck, or with only 4 different spellbooks, this card would be significantly better and much more attractive to run. Talking about Emperor, its effect really isn't impressive because Emperor doesn't get to attack. Therefore, Emperor's effect basically states that you need to give up 2 monsters, banishing 1 and banishing a spellbook from the graveyard for access to 1 opponent's monster for 1 turn. You can summon Emperor through effects like Reaper, Magical Dimension, or Magician's Circle to take off the strain of it being a tribute, but you can also summon other cards with these effects as well. For me, the effect is just not worth it. If Emperor could attack as well as steal the monster, then this effect could be a possible finisher and might have some value in a Prophecy deck, but overall it's really just too inconsistent and lackluster. Looking at the non-tribute monsters, for my taste the pickings are also somewhat slim. For example, looking at Charioteer, I want to use my spellbook cards. I don't want to trade them in for monsters. If this card's effect was a spin-off of Summoner Monk's effect, where I could special summon a Prophecy monster when doing something to a spellbook card, like removing 1 in my graveyard from play and returning 1 in my graveyard to my deck, then I think this card would be much better, a lot more combo potential. However, that's not the effect, thus I'm not really interested in running this card. Basket is Charioteer. I've never really been a fan of level increasing effects, and without judgment, returning spellbooks to the deck for such a lackluster effect, it's just not worth it. Fool and Justice, I think both these cards have kind of the same problem, and their effects activate during the end phase, so you do not get an opportunity to apply the benefits of their effect until the next turn. The different names requirement for fools combined with only the ability to summon from the deck, not the hand and or graveyard, basically kills any real utility that can be had for fool. You have to get extremely lucky to use it effectively. And I think Fool is one of those incredibly poorly designed cards. It could have been a lot better, a lot more useful. Justice, the effect leaves you down one less monster and also forces you to develop a means to summon the added monster during your next turn. Overall, I'm just not a fan of the card, and I think some people use it just because they like chasing advantage, even if that advantage can hurt the overall consistency of the deck. Also, I think Justice is a bad top deck. It's not a good late game card, and at only 1600 attack, it has trouble getting over a number of commonly run cards. Hermit's kind of a card that I want to like, but it just doesn't do enough for me. I would have preferred an attack increase of 600 and only a single level increase instead of the currently existing effect, less attack and 2 levels. It's true that under the right circumstances you can combo a pair of Hermits into producing a rank 7 XZ, but those circumstances are just too infrequent for my tastes. Amoris and Stoic of Prophecy, they're just not good enough to warrant spots in what I would view a good Prophecy deck. I think the cards almost just come off as filler. We need some more Prophecy cards. Okay, we'll just throw these together. If Amoris was level 4 instead of level 3, then I think it might be worth a lot more, but it's not. After this kind of massacre of the Prophecy monsters, that leaves Temperance and Spellbook Magician as the 2 Prophecy cards I choose to run in my deck. Some other Spellbook decks I've seen do not run Temperance at all, or only at 1. That confuses me. I think Temperance is a much better version of Fool or Justice. Maybe people are turned off by the summoning restriction, and I would agree that kind of a banished-themed dark build might want to shy away from Temperance because it wants to summon, mass summon numerous times over the course of the turn. However, this build, hey, I just want to get Priestess or World out fast. I don't care about summoning multiple high-level monsters in a single turn. Spellbook Magician, which is popularly known as Blue Boy, is a staple simply because it searches, and interestingly enough, due to its wording, can actually be searched by Spellbook of Secrets, significantly increasing the speed of this deck. The analysis of the Prophecy monsters, and with only 9 monsters in the deck, what other monsters are appropriate for this deck? In my opinion, there are 2 monsters that are essential for any deck that runs Spellcasters: Magical Exemplar and Defender the Magical Knight. Unless you have horrible luck in a Spellbook deck, Exemplar might as well read every other turn special summon a Spellcaster monster from your graveyard. Exemplar makes mid-game XZ plays much easier, increases swarming potential, and allows greater variety in deck strategy, including using synchros, especially with some of the cards that are available. The reason for running Defender is defined simply by its name. Reading Defender's effect, we're reminded that it does not need to remove a counter from itself to protect monsters, but simply a counter from any card you control. Combining Defender with Spellbook Starhall produces an effective defensive wall to neutralize your opponent's attack flow, as well as gives you a level of protection to ward off, Ragna Zero plays by your opponent. Because Starhalls, does have that continuous attack increasing effect, and if you use it, Ragna Zero tends to wreck decks like that. Finally, Defender also maximizes the probability of making use of Tower's effect because it provides, that Spellcaster field presence. Rounding out the monsters, there's a level of flexibility with the remaining monsters you can run in this deck, partially based on what you want to reuse from the graveyard with Exemplar's effect. I run 2 copies of Effect Veiler for both the obvious effect negation as well as easy level 5 and possible level 9 synchro plays through Exemplar. But another couple of options are Mathematician for potential additional draw power, only costs 3 counters, Summoner Monk for more consistent XZ plays, or Injection Fairy Lily for just raw attack power, something that Spellbook Prophecies can tend to lack. Moving on to the spell cards, the standard staples, of course: 1 Raigeki, 1 Book of Moon, 1 Soul Charge, 2 Dark Holes. If Defender's on the field with Starhall, the Dark Hole is, in large respects, basically a Raigeki. When we look at the Spellbook spell cards, I run 3 copies of Spellbook of Secrets, and it's an obvious staple for this deck, providing deck thinning as well as versatility and counters for Star Hall. Spellbook of Power is a nice card. I'd like to run it at 3, but due to space considerations, I only run it at 2. But the temporary attack boost and the searching potential, high quality. I only run 2 copies of Spellbook of the Master, as while its copy effect makes it the most versatile spellbook, and the requirement of another spellbook in hand lowers its effectiveness, especially when you start getting into top decks, because spellbooks at times they can run a little hand thin as you're moving through your deck pretty quickly. While I'm not a huge fan of Grand Spellbook Tower, I do appreciate the advantage gained from its effect. Draw 1 card at the cost of adding 1 spellbook spell back to the deck. I only run 2 copies. I don't use terraforming because there's so many ways of searching out spellbook cards that terraforming is just a waste in this deck. I run 2 copies of Star Hall because of its protection combined effect with Defender and its attack power increase attribute. The attack increase is important because outside of World and High Priestess, this deck can have problems controlling the field, for its monsters only have mid-range attack power. The secondary special summons effect will not activate consistently, but it's a nice benefit when it goes off, because sometimes your opponent can just get really frustrated by the fact that you've got a Defender and a Star Hall sitting there with 7 or 8 counters on it. Rounding out the spellbooks, I run 1 copy of Spellbook of Wisdom for additional protection of Priestess or World when Defender is not available, 1 copy of Spellbook of Life for revival and possible high-level XZ plays, and 1 copy of Spellbook of Fate because it's a versatile and high-quality card, and realistically it's just the best spellbook card overall. Some might question the lack of any spellbook library of Crescents. I don't run this card because I feel that outside the first turn it's extremely inconsistent in a deck that doesn't remove spellbooks from the graveyard, either returning them to the deck with high frequency or taking them out of the graveyard and putting them in the banish zone, and it's generally a bad card because of it. First turn this card's great, but both probability dictates and my personal experience has demonstrated that I get this card more outside of my first turn when it's dead versus on my first turn. For my trap cards, I run 4 of the general staples, 1 Torrential Tribute, 1 Bottomless Trap Hole, 1 Solemn Warning, and 1 Compulsory Evacuation device. My extra deck is comprised of 1 Mist Wurm, because multiple target bounce is almost always useful, 1 Trishula, Dragon of the Ice Barrier. I really don't think they should have unbanned this card. 1 Armades, you eliminate graveyard effects during the damage step. 1 Samsara, Dragon of Rebirth, Defensive Wall, Monster Reborn effect. 1 Hierophant of Prophecy, it's a 2800 attack point heavy storm. 1 number 11 Big Eye, the rank 4 staples, 1 Exciton, 1 number 101, 1 Castel, 1 XYZ Dragon. I also run 1 Anti-Luminescent Knight, 1 Abyss Dweller, 1 Gaga Cowboy, and I run 2 Sky Cavalries, because you can make it with 2 Blue Boys that you can get out with Exemplar's effects, especially if you stack Exemplars. If you have 2 on the field, you can pull 2 from your graveyard or your hand. Overall, in conclusion, I think the Spellbook Prophecy is one of those decks that I somewhat get annoyed when I build one, because I tend to want 44, 45 cards in the deck, but those extra cards typically produce unnecessary weight and slow the deck down. For example, if you look at this deck build, to make the 40 card limit, I don't have any back row removal. Instead, I really do rely on Defender and Exemplar to make up the difference through their protection and summoning attributes and High Priestess's effect. The biggest problem with this deck is that while it has high levels of searching even without judgment, that searching doesn't amount to much, because most of their effects focus on getting other spellbooks into your hand, which in the end does little beyond deck thinning, going 1 for 1 a lot. The simple reality is this deck structure was largely designed in a way that it's almost dependent on judgment, both through spellbooks and prophecy monsters. For example, Charioteer's effect is fine the turn after a big judgment play, as you're more than happy to give up one spellbook card to add Priestess back into your hand, and oh look, I have at least 3 more spellbooks in my hand. I can now special summon Priestess, and now I can start my swarming. In almost all other scenarios, Charioteer's effect is lackluster and almost worthless. I think for Spellbooks of Prophecy to be successful, they need a card like, I don't know, something called Spellbook of Evolution. That's a continuous spell. Once per turn, tribute 1 Spellcaster monster on your field. You could then reveal to your opponent any number of Spellbook cards in your hand. Special summon 1 Spellcaster monster from your deck or graveyard with a level equal to or less than the level of the tributed monster, plus 2 times the number of Spellbook cards you reveal from your hand. You can only have 1 Spellbook of Evolution on your field at one time. And so, until the deck gets some form of card like that, where you can actually turn those spellbooks into meaningful, hey, we're summoning stuff off the spellbooks outside of a card like Temperance, I think the deck's only real way of success is this type of design, where you're relying on Exemplar and Defender to set up your world and Priestess plays with a sufficient level of consistency. Well, that's my build. Thank you for your attention and your time. I'm out.